Just tonight, I would like to introduce you to Bob BozeBell, and he will be our speaker this evening.
Thank you. You're the man. Hey, it's especially groovy to be back in my stomping grounds because this is where I grew up, and I want to take you on a little mental tour of all the places that I used to camp and hang out at and party at. And in fact, the place where I lost my virginity is in this list. So, sorry, this is not the Brett Kavanaugh, but I am going to tell you. So you got to pay attention because we're going to start at Topak. We're going to move north. We're going to go into Oatman, around the corner to Gold Road. We're going to go down into the Silver Creek Road, back down to Bullhead, Fort Mojave, go up over to Union Pass, into Golden Valley. You guys have been on the same road, haven't you? Up to Coyote Pass, Mineral Park. Don't forget Surbats. Don't forget White Cliffs. Don't forget Kingman, Beale Springs. Head out to the east towards Red Lake. Diamond Bar Ranch is up there with Mead View. You go around the bend into Hackberry, Truxton, Peach Springs, where my father had a gas station in 1946, and I put my hand in a ringer because my mom told me not to, and I had to. And the ringer stopped right at my elbow and ground it out. My dad drove the 53 miles to Kingman, Arizona, where Dr. A.A. Arnold grafted skin off my behind, and it's still here, and I'll show it to you afterwards. I'm here because of the Japanese. They bombed Pearl Harbor. My father was a farm boy in Thompson, Iowa. He got drafted. He went to Alabama for basic training. They shipped him to the God-forsaken desert. He got off a troop train in downtown Kingman, Arizona on his 21st birthday, and he said, and I quote, "I will never come back to this God-forsaken place." He's buried at Mountain View Cemetery in Kingman. Here's why. There were 10,000 GIs at the Kingman Air Base and 500 available women in Kingman. Now I say available because those are the single ones. There were others, but we won't go there. My mother was one of 5 daughters, the Guess girls they called them. Their name was Guess. They hailed out of Big Spring, Texas. They came across into New Mexico. My grandfather was born in Weed, New Mexico, a rancher. Went busted in 1929, came up to work for Tap Duncan on the Diamond Bar Ranch. Tap Duncan was related to Blackjack Ketchum, John Wesley Hardin, Bigfoot Wallace. These are legendary Texan names, and I loved that I was related to outlaws. And it drove my mother crazy. Because everywhere I went, I go, hey, I'm related to outlaws. And I'd name them all. And what she heard was, we're related to Charlie Manson and Jack the Ripper. That's what she heard. But I'm moving ahead of the story. So my mother was dating captains, lieutenants. She was having her pick of the litter, the best ranchers in the county, and she picked a buck private from Thompson, Iowa, my father. I was born in Forest City, Iowa in 1946. My father immediately left to come back here, the place he swore he'd never come back. And he had a Signal Oil gas station in Peach Springs, Arizona, which is where I put my hand in the ringer. We went back to Iowa. In fact, we went back to Iowa every summer. We were on Route 66 and going backwards, and we were meeting all the people going to California and Disneyland and the beach, and they had inner tubes on the top of the car, and they're all laughing, and they're in bikinis, and we're Norwegians going to Iowa. So we can eat 5 times a day and talk about crops. Anyway, every summer we would go, and of course my dad was old school. You had to get up at 4 a.m., you had to drive for an hour. We always stopped at the Copper Cart in Sligman, Arizona, and my dad always had 2 eggs over easing with bacon and coffee. I was precocious. I was an only child. My mother lost 2 children. And so she doted on me and made me wear a scarf, which I didn't wear tonight for obvious reasons. Anyway, she really, you know, wanted to please me. My dad was the Norwegian who didn't want to ever stop, all right? I remember we were on Route 66 and I was standing on the transmission hump and I see these signs going by and it goes, world's largest buffalo. And I go, hey, Dad, can we stop? We get into New Mexico, it gets worse. Live Indians, I guess as opposed to the other, I don't know, you know, live, come on, Dad, can we stop? And I realized he was only going to stop for gas, food, oil, maybe open wounds, but that was it. We weren't stopping for nothing because we had to get to Iowa and talk about the crops. So I spotted this place, and it was 43 miles east of Albuquerque, New Mexico. It was called the Longhorn Museum, and we shot by there at 80 miles an hour. Was anybody on Route 66 in the 50s and 60s? Raise your hand. I want to. Was that road any wider than this table? That was, it was a narrow little road, okay? And when you drove on it, a lot of the sections had cement. So it'd sound kind of like a train. It'd go. But when my dad drove, it was. So I picked out this place. It was a Longhorn Museum, south side of the road, 43 miles east of Albuquerque, Mexico, in a place called Moriarty. So we got to Iowa, and we were eating for the fourth time of the day down to Swenson's. Oh, no, that's right, Marge, don't get us anything. We just ate down to the Larson's. Here comes the feed, you know. And so I said to my dad, hey, you got to give me one place to stop at on the way back. You know what he said? Well, we will, kid, if we have time. I knew what that was about. He's going to drive right back to Kingman and never stop for anything. So I hatched a devious plan. I looked on a map, and at Santa Rosa, New Mexico, we were coming out of the Club Cafe for breakfast. Been there? Yeah, the Club Cafe. And these are legendary places. And we got in the car, and my dad had a 1957 Ford with a Continental kit on the back. And we got out on that highway, and he starts cruising with his hands in the 10 and 2 position. But I knew, even as a 10-year-old kid, that every father has a weak spot. It runs from the neck right down to the shoulder. It's a weak spot right here. And so I started poking him. Come on, Dad, you promise. And he's shaking me off, you know, he's passing 10 trucks. Come on, Dad, you promise me. He swung that 57 Ford into that dirt parking lot, put it in park, he looked in the back seat, and he said, kid, you've got 15 minutes. Those are the most precious 15 minutes of my life. It's why I'm standing before you here now. He made a lunatic out of me by not letting me do what I wanted to do. And so I went in that museum, and I'm looking around, and the place has just got junk everywhere, you know. It's got chaps and ropes hanging off and cow skulls, and I was in a buying mood because my grandpa gave me a quarter. He said, buy something on the way back. So I'm looking around, and I go, how much for that flintlock rifle there behind the bar? The guy goes, $100. I'll give you a quarter. He wasn't going for that. I looked over here, and it said, an authentic photo of Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. How much for that? A quarter. Boom, I bought that picture. My dad took me by the scruff of the neck, took me out in the parking lot, threw me in the back of that car, peeled out of that driveway, and got back on Route 66 to catch all the trucks that got by us while we were in that damn museum. My mom's worried about me. We go shooting through Albuquerque, right down Central Avenue, out the other side, around to Cabero, out the other end to Laguna. Past Acoma, they pronounce it Acoma over there, not Acoma. Acoma. To Cabero, into Arizona, Holbrook, Winslow, Flagstaff, don't forget Winona. obscure reference to a Bobby Troop song that evidently no one here knows. Anyway, my mom's worried about me. Are you all right? I said, I'm studying this authentic photo of Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. It's mine, man. I paid $0.25 for it. I get home, I put it on the wall right next to where I'm going to go to school, and I can look at it, and I'm looking at that picture, and I go, someday I'm going to have a hat like that, I'm going to have a coat like that, and a pistol like that, and I'm in love with it. About a week later, my mom had to go to Desert Drugs in downtown Kingman, and I ran up to the front of the store to buy my favorite magazine, True West, that tells the true stories of the Wild West. And while my mom is talking to Margaret, I go out to the car, and on page 32, I discover that the photograph I bought at the Longhorn Museum, purportedly of Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett, is a fake! I'm so mad now, but I was going to get madder, because my grandmother, who was from the old ranching family from Duncan, Arizona, and who had the 5 daughters who are all rodeo queens and superb dancers, she would tell me when I would go to her house how we were related to outlaws, which I told you I love. And so, one night, Thursday, I had to go stay with my grandmother. Her nickname was Gessie because their last name was Guess. And so she was from the last people in that generation that didn't like TV. If you're old enough, you remember that we bought TVs for our parents, and they were like, not going to watch that box, you know. it would just sit there. But my favorite show was coming on. Whew. And so she was talking to me about how the outlaws would come in the night at a ranch, and they'd steal a horse, and sometimes they'd leave a better horse than the one that they took. You know, and I was like, wow, that just sounds like a great deal. So anyway, I finally got up enough nerve, and I said, Grandma, can I turn the TV on? And so I ran over to that TV, I turned it on just in time to hear this theme song, and I see a couple folks here who are old enough, you know who you are, and if you know the words to this, you have to sing it with me. Wyatt Earp, Wyatt Earp, brave, courageous, and bold. Long live his fame, and long live his glory, and long
may his story be told.
An old guy right there. I can't believe that, young man. That's an old guy right there. Anyway, for all you youngsters who don't remember the show with Hugh O'Brien, he drank milk, he didn't swear, he wasn't married, he cleaned up every cow town in the West, and in the middle of that, oh, that's right, and he had a pistol with a barrel that went all the way to the ground. You know, it wasn't a 7.5-inch Colt, wasn't a 9-inch, it went all the ground. He could write his name in the dirt with a barrel. Right in the middle of the song, my grandmother points at the TV, right into my field of vision, and says, and I quote, Wyatt Earp was the biggest jerk who ever walked the West. Really? I'm looking at the TV, right, which never lies. Looking at my grandmother, and I'm going, wow, somebody's not telling the truth here, and I aim to find out. And so I missed the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, I missed the hula hoop craze, I even missed the Kennedy assassination. That's not true, but I was in the library studying about what did these guys do. And that led me, I won't bore you with the whole story, but there's a book back there on Billy the Kid, and the picture that I bought for $0.25 is a treasure to me. Now, isn't that amazing? I bought a fake photo. It's framed in my office. I look at it every day. It's a treasure. Now, do you remember a couple years ago when Bill Koch bought the only known photo of Billy the Kid for $2.3 million? Anybody know that? See if I can put my hands on this because you got to see it. You can look at it afterwards. Billy the Kid bought the photos at Fort Sumner, New Mexico, we think, in 1880. And a traveling photographer took a picture of him. It's called a ferrotype, and there's 4 lenses, and it makes a tin. He develops it. His thumbprints are on the actual tin photo, and then he took shears and he snipped it in 4 pieces, so there was 4 photos. Okay. There's only one surviving that we know of, and Bill Koch paid $2.3 million. What do you think Billy the Kid paid for those 4 photos? A quarter. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So now let's come back to Mojave County for a minute. So when I was growing up, Oatman was, a town that we would go to on the weekends, and Gold Road. And the scuttlebutt from me growing up that I heard from my grandmother and from the old timers was that Oatman was named by Olive Oatman's son, who was part Mojave, and he was the one who discovered the town, and that's how the town got its name. Now that's what I grew up with. I don't even remember who said it, but it was just that kind of like common folklore that everybody hears. So I became extremely interested in it, obviously because of the local angle, and I wanted to know more about it, what really happened. That's always the thing that drives me. And so the first thing I did was I ordered the book written by Royal Stratton, who was the minister from Yreka, California. And he says a really intriguing thing in the beginning of the book. The book's absolutely fantastic. Anybody read Captivity of the Oatman Girls by herself? Oh, you have to go read it. You have to. There's going to be a book report next month. I'll be here. We'll collect them down the rows. I'll take them, and then you're going to fail. You're going to fail this class. I've been telling you, especially you, young lady. You're pretending to listen, but I know that your gut mind is on something else. Anyway, it's a riveting story. And the quote, which is the one that just drove me around the bend, is the quote that he wrote where he said, and I'm going to find it. Much of that dreadful period is unwritten and will remain forever unwritten. That, to me, was a taunt. To cut to the chase, I don't have time to tell you the whole story tonight, but let me kind of give you the highlights. Oh, here's something to cut to this. So I'm driving up from Phoenix, and so I'm coming through Wickenburg, out to Gila, to Wendon, to Siloam. You've all obviously been that way many, many times, I assume. Those mountains on the left, the Harquahalas, that's where they took her. After they killed her family, they took the 2 girls, and we believe now that that's the mountains where they took them. And these were renegade Yavapais. We used to think they were Tono Apaches, but there's a problem with that story, and that is the Apaches did not trade with the Mojaves. And it's so fun to be here talking to you and point there and go, yeah, the Mojaves are right there, right on the other side of those little mountains right there. So anyway, I'm driving up today, and I'm looking over there, and I'm just going, she was right up there. And to me, what makes history riveting is to walk where they walk, is to be where they were. And I don't know what it is. There's a little magic fairy dust or something that happens there, because when you're standing in the OK Corral where that fight happened and you're on the actual space, you can almost feel the molecules go through. Oh, I can, okay, but I'm a crazy kid, all right? So that really drove me on this story. And so she's, her family's killed. Now, they were killed with war clubs, which is horrible, and I won't get into the details of it, but her brother, Lorenzo, was hit 4 times on the head. Now, these are death blows. They wanted to put him out of their misery and killed him, okay? And they take the girls, they take their shoes off, just to be mean, okay, and made them walk 96 miles, and they're bleeding, and the younger girl is saying, kill me. And they end up on top of that mountain. Next time you're at Siloam, look right up that mountain. That's where they are. They spend a year there, And then the Mojaves come and pay some vegetables and a horse and a couple of other things and buy them, okay? Now you can imagine what they're thinking. Now Lorenzo, who was hit 4 times in the head, wakes up. They didn't kill him. And he starts walking, and he falls down, and he's having psychedelic-like hallucinations, and wolves are coming right up to his face. They're just like, come on, we want to eat you in a minute. Here, come on, you know. And he's like, shoot him away. He's rescued. They take him to Fort Yuma, which was the destination of the Altmans to begin with. And he goes on to California, and he wants to talk to anyone who will help him rescue his sisters because he feels they're still alive. So now the 2 Altman girls are, they literally walk through here. They're probably through this gymnasium, but it wasn't here. And they go through the Needles. They get to where the town of Needles is. They cross the river. Here's an interesting thing, and if you have a theory on this, I want to hear it. They keep crossing the river. Now, they're great swimmers. We know that. She became a great swimmer. Olive Altman herself did, okay? She was a really powerful swimmer, and she learned that from the Mojaves. Now, how did they get, let me fast forward. So when she's rescued, when she's freed, and we believe that she didn't want to be freed because she'd spent 4 years there and probably had 2 children. So she's kidnapped again. And as my wife says, she lost 2 mothers. She lost her mother that was killed in the initial attack. She has a mother here at Needles and is raising 2 children by the chief's son. And now these guys come up the river and they were going to liberate her. Okay, so she loses 2 mothers. She says an interesting thing. You do know that the Colorado River was totally unlike what it is now. It's a bathtub now. But in those days, it ran between the rocks, which would be where the Parker Dam is, and there's no variation there. But when it got out in the flats between there, like in the Mojave Valley, the river would literally change course overnight. So the steamboat captains would come up one way, and they'd get out in those valleys, and all of a sudden they'd come up into a cul-de-sac where the water, the river had channeled, 55 yards over the other way. So they'd have to get out and they'd put these hooks in the ground and crawl back, push backwards to get back. And they said that these captains could captain those boats on 2 inches of water. So the Colorado River was just so wild and so ridiculous, okay? And so that's how crazy the river was. Of course, it was not like it is now. It looks like a blue, painting from, Norman Rockwell or something. It was so brown and so silt, they said the famous saying was, it's too thin to plow and too thick to drink. Anyway, when she's rescued, she says, we had to swim 10 times to get to Yuma. And so then here's my question to you, and I can't figure this out. The guys who rescued her were 2 brothers and cousin, and they were scouts, and they were related, I can't remember, they're Chemehuevi, they were related to the tribe so that they could get in and not, and get out alive. But you know that they were armed. They had to have been armed. It's 1856. And so they're obviously carrying cap and percussion. They were obviously carrying weapons. Here's what I want to know. When you swim 10 times through 10 channels, where do you put your weapons? On your head? They didn't have boats. They didn't have rafts. Anybody know? I'm asking you a question. I'd love to hear your theory on that because that just blows my mind, the fact that they swam 10 times. And then can you imagine, getting out? I believe it was February, getting out and you're all wet and then you got to walk. Oh, we got to swim again. And then get back in the river and you got to swim another channel. I find those things absolutely phenomenal. Now let's back up a little bit. Why were the Altmans headed for here, okay? For Yuma, that was actual location. Well, there was a Latter-day Saints prophet whose name was James Collins Brewster. He was 24 years old, and he did not subscribe to the Brigham Young school of multiple wives. He didn't believe in polygamy, and so he was going to have his own branch of the Mormon church, and he was charismatic, and he talked a whole bunch of people to leave Springfield, Missouri in the spring of 1850. And there were 93 people, 40 wagons, and the woman, Susan Thompson, I believe was her name, she described it, in later years, she described the trip, the first part, as a continuous picnic. They would catch fish, they would stop, they'd kill a deer, they danced every night, there was romance, they were having a really great time, it was wonderful. And then, by the time they got to Socorro, New Mexico, their numbers had been cut in half. They couldn't agree. The kid, Brewster, he had a new vision. Oh, it's here in Socorro. He didn't want to go on. Okay, but here's the part that blows my mind. He put out a tract, he put out a little pamphlet in 1848 that said, we're going to the land of Bashan, and it's going to be a magical place, and there's going to be no war, and the ground is going to open up and be bountiful, and all the things under heaven will come to all of you who come with me to the land of Bashan. And his location for the land of Bashan was the confluence of the Gila and the Colorado River, Yuma, where there's about 3.5 inches of rain a year. It's sand dunes up to your eyebrows. You couldn't farm a fig out of that thing. So when the Mormons that were on that trip, like when they got down to Tucson, there was only 3 wagons left. And then they came to Maricopa, which is just south of Phoenix, and they spent a month there. And then, once again, I swear, so many times in real history, if you saw it in a movie, you'd go, yeah, like there would be a bug collector collecting beetles, the bugs, not the band, collecting beetles along the Gila River, and he's prancing along, and he's got a guy with him named Juan the Sonorian, and there's one there, and he pokes him, and he puts him in chloroform, and he puts him in his little thing, and he's taken along. So he goes through 2 lakes in California, comes to Yuma, goes down all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, comes back, collecting beetles all the way, by the way, comes all the way up the Gila to Maricopa, goes down to Tucson, eats some Mexican food, comes back, and runs right up on the tail of the wagon, at the Oltman wagon, and goes, oh, what are you guys doing? And they said, well, our oxen are given out. And he basically says, he leaves a note saying, look out for Indians. I'm going to go down to Fort Yuma and warn them to come and get you, okay? And 2 days later, the same Indians we think now who ambushed the Oatmans. And by the way, they didn't ambush him. You know how in the movies, it's like, you know, I mean, no. They walked up the trail and they said, ¿Cómo está? Muy bien, y tú? And they asked for Pinoli. They asked for smoke. They smoked. And then they noticed that Mr. Oatman's weapon was in the wagon. He wasn't armed. It was a bunch of women and little kids. The mother was 8.5 months pregnant. And they literally stepped off to one side and said, you kill her, I'll kill her. Save these 2. To me, that's 10 times more riveting and ridiculous, than the attack that we see in all the movies. So anyway, the bug guy, they steal his horses and stuff, and so he sends Juan the Sonorian back to Yuma, which is 100 miles, by the way, and says, warn him, I'm going to look for more beetles. And so he's out there poking beetles and stuff by himself, and he's unhorsed, and he gets to Fort Yuma 2 weeks later and says, did you go out and help the Oatmans? And he goes, no, it's out of my jurisdiction. The commander says, it's in Mexico. And at that time, the Gila River was the boundary to Mexico, and they were killed on the south side. So in a typical guy trying to not do his job. He says, it's not my jurisdiction. They were killed in Mexico. And he says, you better go out there or I will have you, I'm going to report you. And so the commander wrote in his diary that night, Dr. Bugs. And so you can't make that up. That's just redonkulous, as my daughter would say. So anyway, Olive Oatman is rescued, in quotes. And then the question becomes, did she leave behind 2 children? Now, in the story, in the Stratton book, the famous book that I just read you the prologue to, that he said there was many things here that I can't talk about. In the book, he says that they were not sexually untoward her. And here's the evidence, and it's in the magazine. I think I have enough for everybody. I brought this cover story, which tells the story much better than I'm jumping all over the place, but you need to have this book, magazine. There are 5 people who knew the truth, and one of them was Charlotte Hall. And in 1906, a writer wanted to write about Olive Oatman and what happened to her, and he asked Charlotte Hall, and she wrote him and said, everyone here knows that Olive had 2 children, and one of them is an old man now, and he visits Fort Yuma. Here's the interesting part. When it came time for Olive to write her story about Olive Oatman, when Charlotte Hall was ready, she left that out. Now, I'm a nut for the truth. I want the truth, warts and all. Give it to me. I can take it. I don't want any BS. My grandmother taught me that with the Wyatt Earp show. Okay, but isn't there some integrity to her not including that? I just admire her. It's the opposite of what I believe. Tell it. You got to tell the truth, no matter what. She chose not to. And I'm working on a screenplay right now, and that's the theme of it, is that Charlotte Hall had the class, had something that the woman suffered enough. Why would we drag her through the mud once again? Olive Oatman ended up to be a celebrity. The book was a huge success. She was living in upstate New York. Well, I got to tell you this first. She swims 10 times to Yuma. She gets to Yuma, and they bring her to the commander. It's a different commander by now, because Yuma's a hellhole. Nobody wants to be in Yuma. They still don't. But anyway, the commander says, why did you bring me this Mojave? It's Olive Oatman. No, it's not. That's a Mojave. They had to pull her hair back and show the skin behind her ear to prove to him that she was a white woman. That's how assimilated she was after 4 years with the Mojaves. Her brother, Lorenzo, took the first stage from Southern California and came out and met her, and they went into a room and sat for an hour and stared at each other because they couldn't talk. Her transformation was that profound. She had assimilated herself into being a Mojave. Now here's the part that I think is the smoking gun to this controversy, and that is they traveled by stage to Monte, California, which is today, I believe, El Monte, California, and there was a hotel there, and Susan Thompson, you know, the one who I said it was a perpetual picnic, that was her hotel. And they spent 2 weeks there, and she wrote in the 1960s, she was an old woman, she wrote that we could not erase the wild from her heart. Her wildness shook us. It shook your belief in civilization. The reason she was so distraught is she left 2 children behind. Imagine that. She ended up living in Sherman, Texas, in a rather comfortable life. She married a man. They had no children. And for all the people who think that she was not, violated by the Indians, you could make a case that she never had children and perhaps could not, and that's part of, so that's enough evidence that she did not. I'm curious, the women are looking at me. They've got, the women are looking at me like, yeah, like, what do you know, you old man? How many people, based on what I just told you, how many people believe that Olive Oatman had children among the Mojaves? All right, okay. So it's split pretty equal. That's, and that's what makes history so wonderful, because it's always two competing stories. It's the contradiction, it's the conflict. Conflict is the engine of good storytelling. If you don't have conflict, that's why, do you know how when your relatives write a book, I'm going to write a book about the family. We had coffee every day, and my dad liked to sew. You don't want to read it. Why? There's no conflict. The family leaves out the, no, I'm not going to talk about that abortion. Oh, no, I would. My dad would kill me. Well, your book's not interesting. Sorry. It's the conflict that makes for good stories. And that's what drives me on these. That's why people say to me, you've been doing True West for 20 years. 20 years I've been doing this magazine, and people say, well, don't you run out of stuff? And I go, are you kidding me? You know why? Nothing changes more than the past. When I was a kid growing up in Kingman, I thought, well, I'm going to learn what Wyatt Earp really was. I'm going to get to here, I'm going to get to here. I'm going to, slap my hands, and I'm saying, I'm done with that. Let me tell you about Mr. Wyatt Earp, the guy who drank milk and never swore and was a bachelor and cleaned up every cow town in the West. And about 10 years ago, some researchers, friends of mine, were in Peoria, Illinois, looking at microfiche. Remember that? Microfiche, look at the newspaper. And they're looking for relatives of theirs because they want to write the book about how Dad never did anything wrong. But anyway, and so they're looking at a story from 1872, and it said, Wyatt Earp was arrested yesterday on a floating bagnio. Does anyone know what a bagnio is? Do you know, sir? Anybody, any French here? Bagnio, I'm probably mispronouncing it. B-A-G-N-I-O. It's a floating whorehouse in Peoria, Illinois. So he gets home that night, he makes a note of it, and he calls up a friend of his that's a friend of mine who's a Earp expert, and says, hey, was Wyatt Earp hunting buffalo in Peoria, Illinois? I'm sorry, was he in Peoria, Illinois in 1872? No. Everybody's read Stuart Lake. He was hunting buffalo in Kansas. So he thought, oh, okay, it must be a different Wyatt Earp. So he goes back to the next day to look at the microfiche, and he's reading stories and going back, and all of a sudden he goes, Wyatt Earp and his brother Morgan were arrested. Wyatt Earp is an old offender. So now all the researchers descend upon Peoria, Illinois, and they find that Mr. Earp, Mr. Clean, Mr. No Swearing, Mr. Bachelor, is living in a whorehouse. My point is, he wasn't hunting buffalo in 1872, okay? That's how history changes every day. Things that we thought were true. Remember the movie Left-Handed Gun with Paul Newman? Left-Handed Gun. Here was the idea. It's 1958, isn't it? Something like 1958. And the idea, that was blackboard jungle, and the psychologists were telling us that, left-handers are delinquents. That's what, if we could just cure people from being left-handed. And you remember when I told you about getting my arm in the ringer? They put a cast on my arm all the way up to my shoulder, and they said, oh, this will cure him. This will cure him. He's kind of leaning towards left-handed. We don't want him to grow up and be a ne'er-do-well. And so my mother tells the story. She brought the food to my high chair, and I go, and eating off the cast. Anyway, I digress. So the idea was that left-handers are delinquents. And so that leads to the Left-Handed Gun. And James Dean is supposed to play Billy the Kid as a left-handed gun. He's so dangerous because he's left-handed. He's dark, okay? And then a woman, it's always the women who ruin the stories for us. A woman's looking at that photo and goes, you know, I think the buttons are on the wrong side of that vest. I told you it's a ferrotype. Boom. The photo, flip it the other way. He's right-handed. Scratch the movie, scratch the theory. That when I was growing up, that was the theory. He's left-handed, he's a delinquent. That's why he became bad. So Kingman is the craziest damn place. I went through a period, well, get this. So the one thing my parents gave me is we would always go on picnics. We came here in 1962. I couldn't believe my dad brought us here. And there was one building, it was a fishing, one building with a little bit, half of a dock. That's it. It was called Site 6. And I thought to myself, no civilized people will ever live here. And I rest my case. Isn't that crazy? I want to tell you one more story. How are we doing on time? Are we running over? Do we go into the next C-SPAN? You gotta read Martha Summerhays, Vanished Arizona. Who's read it? Yes. You gotta read it. You can't live here. I'm sorry, you can't live here, young man, unless you read that book. You know why? She knows how to write, and she married an Army officer in 1874, and they're up in Kansas or Wyoming. I can't remember which. He's from New England. And he gets his marching orders to go to a new post, and you know where it was? In Afghanistan. That's what Arizona was in 1874. This was Afghanistan. And how did they get there? Well, they didn't go down I-40 and turn south of Flagstaff. They couldn't go into that area because that's the Apaches, all right? So they take a train. They get on a troop train up in Wyoming, and they go all the way to San Francisco. They get on a packet. They go all the way down past San Diego, past Ensenada, all the way down to Cabo San Lucas, where they bring cattle on by making the cattle swim out to the boat, putting rope on their horns, and pulling the cattle into the boat. And she writes this in her diary. She says, oh, this is terrible. The food by then was so rancid that they had to, she's living on coffee and hardtack and leaning over the edge of the boat because the rancid stuff that was in the hold smelled so bad. So they come up into the interior of the Sea of Cortez, and they get to Guaymas, and she goes running up a street and gets some eggs. And she has some eggs, and she's able to go a little bit further. Now they come up into the mouth of the Colorado River, and they need to transfer all the troops to steamboats. And the water's so choppy, they can't make the transfer, and 3 soldiers die from heat. It's 122 degrees in the shade, like Havasu, in August. And they're wearing wool uniforms. So they get up to Yuma, a troop drops off. They get up to Fort Mojave, which is where Laughlin is, right over here. They have more troops off. And then they're going up over Union Pass. He's in the infantry. He's going to walk to Fort Apache. Do you know where that is? That's to go all the way across to Ash Fork, down to Prescott, over to Camp Verde, up the switchbacks to Pine, Payson, up on the rim, Springerville, and down to Fort Apache. He walked that, okay? And she's in a wagon, and one of the guys that was along on the trip, he had an Irish setter with him, and they got out into Golden Valley, and the Irish setter just went crazy and ran to its death. And she said in her diary, no civilized people will ever live here. And she was right. It's Kingman. It's Kingman, I'm telling you. She gets to Fort Apache, 3-month journey. 3-month journey. She gets to Fort Apache. She unpacks her stuff. Some of it went off a cliff going up the switchbacks above Payson and broke all her dishes. The mules felt her to death. She comes out to, I wonder what the other Army wives are doing, and she writes in her diary, and there was the lieutenant's wife playing tennis. There's a tennis court at Fort Apache in 1874, and if you saw that in a John Wayne movie, you'd puke. but it's the truth. So you got to read it. You got to look it up. Martha Summerhays, you'll love it. It's fabulous. She spends time at Ehrenberg. She's here. She's all over this area, and she talks very specifically. It's great because the women talk about how they cooked, but here's the punchline to the story. It took her 3 months to get there, and she's there, and then she writes in her diary, Sammy was born yesterday. She was pregnant. But she couldn't write about that because that was considered in bad form. But she admitted that her son was born the next day. So she was leaning over the hold and not being able to be and drinking coffee. She was pregnant with her son. Crazy. All right, I bored you enough. Let's get on to the questions so you can get on with your evening. I did bring some magazines with me. I brought my Billy the Kid. We will look up that picture that I bought and paid $1 for. It's in there. It's a treasure to me. Who has a question? And please wait for our microphone man here. All right. Martha Summerhays, Vanished, Arizona. Summerhays. Martha Summerhays. Yeah, and you should get one at the museum and support a great cause.
You didn't mention anything about she having tattoo.
Yeah, she. You know what's interesting is that she has the vertical tattoos, and what I didn't get to, it's a rambling story, is that Ariel Weeks Whipple came through here, this very area. In fact, he came up the Bill Williams River, came down the river, came north here, went to the Mojave villages, and he was here for a couple weeks while she's here. And to the people who say that Olive did not have children, he writes this about the Mojaves. The women who are married have 5 vertical stripes under their chin. And so that to me is pretty damning evidence that she was at the very least married. And the tattoos, you know what's weird is my neighbor brought me up the New York Times. It's in vogue now. Here we are. This shows all these young kids with, well, okay, all right. If you live long enough, you're going to see everything just flipped over on its head. Yes, sir. On what happened? On the 2 kids? Yes, all we have, the question is a good question, and that is there any definitive proof? And there is not. I'm giving you my opinion. In the magazine article, I quote the 5 people who knew, but I also quote Margot Mifflin, who wrote the book, The Blue Tattoo, and she does not believe that they had children. I quote her, and she makes a very, compelling case for that they did not. And no, it could not be proven in a court of law. Yes, ma'am.
So I guess the big question for me as a mother is why didn't she have children? Why didn't she go back and try and find them?
And that's a wonderful question. As a mother, if she had 2 children, why wouldn't she go back? And there's a little bit of and she did not, okay? Now there's an intriguing incident that happened in 1866. Iritaba was a Mojave chief who was there when she was there. And he was, Johnny Moss, of the Johnny Moss Mine, paid for him to go back to Washington, D.C. There's evidence that he met Abraham Lincoln at the White House. It's not for sure, but he was on that level. He was visiting and they were treating him. He was in a hotel in New York City, and Olive Oatman is living in northern New York State. And she reads about it. She takes the train all the way to Manhattan. She goes to the hotel. They meet in the lobby, and they shake with the left hand, which is the Mojave preference, to they speak in Mojave. They speak in Mojave, and I just have to believe that. I can't believe that she would be there and not have, at least be married and probably have children. That's me, though. Okay, and Iritaba says, I think it's his daughter, says, when are you going to tire of your pale-faced friends and come back? Isn't that hard, but we don't have her comment. And with train travel and everything, wouldn't she have gone? I mean, I just don't know how a mother could not. And so that may bring us back to maybe she didn't. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I have a comment. It's quite a coincidence. Just today, I drove through the small town of Grinnell, which is a town of maybe 4 or 5 houses. There's one that's much better kept up than the others. There's a memorial around the plaque that says, "This is where Wyatt Earp and his wife lived."
Oh, in Vidal. Yeah, yes. Well, here's a final thing, and we're getting restless. I'm going to let you guys go. Wyatt Earp spent 18 months in Tombstone, the story. He wintered across the river from Parker at his mining claim there for 22 years. He was all up and down this valley. He had a mining claim in the Harquahalas. He ran for sheriff in Cibola. He would come, allegedly, he would come to Needles, White Hills, Gold Road, and fleece the soldiers on payday. So yes, Wyatt Earp was all over. And that always is riveting to me to go, here I thought he was in Dodge City and Tombstone. No, he was in Havasu, dudes. Thank you.